It is especially good to be able to see those who are able to be out today. I suppose illness has hit our congregation this week more so than it has in the 2 years. And so we've faced a lot of challenges, but I'm glad there's a number of folks who are able to be out today and to worship God and to honor Him. And those of us who are home and not feeling well today but have joined us, we appreciate you taking some time and worshiping with us and studying with us this morning. I suppose it's possible that we forget that God has expectations of us. I think man has a lot of expectations of God, and maybe even inaccurately so. I think there are times where man has, in a sense, requirements that he places on God, and anytime God doesn't live up to that standard or doesn't measure up to what man thinks God ought to be, then we decide, well, God doesn't even need to be in the picture at all anymore because He's not who I wanted Him to be. He's not fulfilling the purposes or answering the questions or resolving the challenges that I have in the way that I would like, and so therefore I just push Him aside. But friends, may I suggest to you that it's the reverse. Man doesn't get to label expectations upon God. God puts the expectations on man. God looks at man and says, here's what I desire from you, and if you'll do these things, here are the results or the consequences, whatever it might be, as it relates to the decisions and choices that you and I make. And so I got to thinking about that, especially in this narrative here in Exodus chapter 19, where you think about the idea that throughout history, God has always placed expectations upon His people. And so this morning, for a little while, if you would, let's just kind of look through some of these things, and maybe we can reestablish in our own minds the fact that God has rightful expectations of all of us, and that it would behoove all of us to honor and fulfill those expectations as we move forward. I want you to look at the last two verses of that reading that Billy read for us just a moment ago. And I want you to pick up in verse 5 of Exodus chapter 19 and notice what God declares to the people through Moses in this particular moment. He says, "Now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, then," did you notice that? "Then you will be." It's something that He wants them to understand. If this happens, then this can happen. If you will obey my voice, if you'll listen to the instructions that I give, if you will connect yourself and pay attention to the commands and statutes that I establish with you, then you shall be a special treasure to me above all people, for all the earth is mine. You want to be the special people of God, then God has rightful expectation to say to us, listen, you need to obey my voice. You need to listen to my instructions. I think we want to be a special people without listening to God. At times we want to be the special treasure. We want God to care for us, take care of us, provide for us, do all the things that we look for from Him, but have no desire whatsoever to actually listen to the instructions of God. The expectations historically sometimes from man has been reversed, and that's a mistake on our part if we do that. God very clearly says, if you will indeed obey my voice, if you'll keep my covenants, then you can be this treasure to me upon the earth. Verse 6, "And you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words which you shall speak to the children of Israel." Go tell the folks here in Israel this information, Moses. Go let them know that with blessings from God comes expectation. Let them know that with the honor and privilege that it is to be the children of God in a very peculiar way for them, and I suppose in some senses those who are believers in Jesus have a very peculiar relationship with Him as well. And so He challenges us in symbolic senses from this narrative to fulfill and obey the voice of God as well. He has a right to expect that of me. To not just simply look to Him when I need Him, but to live daily, expecting from myself to obey and to fulfill the purposes that God establishes. And so when I think about that expectation, there's a very broad sense there in that narrative. Then let's look at a couple of other texts that relate to this topic. And think about how it is that God places requirements, if you will, upon man, and how it is that we need to be responding to that. If you run over a couple of books, over into the book of Deuteronomy chapter 10. Let's look at a couple of verses together. In Deuteronomy chapter 10 and verse 12, he says, "And now, Israel, what does the Lord your God require of you?" Now, by the way, that shouldn't be a concerning or a scary thing to us. The idea that God has a requirement of us shouldn't be something that we fear. It should be something we embrace and say, okay, what are they? I want to know what God wants from me because that's what I want to do in my life. I want to fulfill His purposes. I want to honor Him. I want to be that part of that peculiar people to Him. And so what is it? So that's the challenge set here in verse 12. What does God require of you? But, simplistically stated, to fear the Lord your God. May I suggest to you that one of man's problems today, and maybe problems that man have had for a long time, is we have lowered God to such a point that we don't fear Him anymore. Some might say, well, what's the danger in making God a little more accessible in the idea of lowering who He is to look a lot more like us? And what's the danger in that? Why is that a problem to speak and think of God in the same fashion that I would my buddy I work with or the person that's in my family or whomever I run into? And the problem is, God deserves a level of fear and respect above all that. And when we lower who God is and we begin to look and view Him as nothing more than just somebody else that I have connection to, then I won't have the same level of fear. Friends, I should not fear you the same way I fear God. And the respect and awe that I stand in the presence of God in should be far greater. And so he says the very first step to understanding what God requires of me, what God's expectations of me are, is number one, fear Him. Fear God. To walk then in all His ways. If you fear Him, you'll walk. If you respect Him, you'll walk in His ways. And to love Him, to serve the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul. With the proper respect and fear for God, then I'll turn everything over to Him. I won't withhold anything from my Creator. I won't hold anything from God. I will serve Him to the fullest. I will walk in His ways. I will serve and love Him. I will appreciate all that He provides for me. I will give Him all of my heart and all of my soul, every ounce of my being. That is a rightful expectation from our Creator. And though that is challenging, and though it is an expectation that we don't always live up to, it's an expectation that God rightfully has bestowed upon us. Go to verse 16 of Deuteronomy chapter 10. Therefore circumcise the foreskin of your heart and be stiff-necked no longer. Quit resisting the expectations of God. That's the point he's making. For the Lord your God is God of gods and Lord of lords. If you're reading from King James or New King James, you'll probably see how they use capital G and then lowercase, capital L. There are all kinds of things that people might attribute and say that's a God or that's a Lord. Or that's somebody that should be paid respect to, or that's somebody that should be given some kind of prestige. But he says, listen, among all those that people talk about, Jehovah God is God. He is the Lord, the great God. Mighty and awesome, He who shows no partiality, nor takes a bribe. Can I pause and think about that thought with you for a minute? God shows no partiality, nor takes a bribe. Isn't that an interesting statement? God is not sitting in heaven looking for us to make a deal with Him. Well, if you do this, then God, if you'll fulfill this, then I can do this, and or maybe if you'd let me do this. God's not sitting in heaven looking for us to kind of have this exchange. He is God of gods. He is Lord of lords. He's put His expectations and requirements upon us. He's told mankind what He desires from each and every one of us, and it's my responsibility then to do all that I can within all of my heart and with all of my soul to fulfill that. He's not going to take a bribe. He's not looking to make a deal. He's not going to show partiality. You know, it's impossible to walk in everybody's shoes. And what I mean by that is, I know the people sitting in this room, but I don't know everything you deal with on a daily basis. I don't know every challenge. I don't know every heartache. I don't know every difficulty that you experience. And the truth be known, I would find it challenging to try to walk in your shoes. And while we're being honest, you might be surprised if you look the other way. The difficulties and challenges that all of us face. And my point is this. We need to be careful that we don't say, well, I'm not doing what God wants from me, but you got to understand. Here we go, right? You got to understand, I'm dealing with this, and I'm dealing with that, and I've got this situation, and I've got that. And what we're hoping for is that God will show partiality. And that God will say, well, your circumstances warrant some leniency that aren't warranted for that go over there because his life is so much better and his benefits are so greater and he has such a better life than you have. I'll make him fulfill the requirements, but I'll show leniency to. Now, I'm trying to say it very specifically so you'll get what I'm talking about. And maybe we've all been there. Where we felt like, well, that guy has it easy. He can serve God real easy. It's easy for him. And it's hard for me. And so therefore, God, don't expect as much from me as you do of him. And that, I think, what we need to be careful of. Because God doesn't show partiality. God doesn't show respecter of persons. God doesn't take bribes. God isn't looking to make deals. He just simply says, this is what my expectations are, and you and I have the responsibility as His children, as His creation, to fulfill those things. And here we are, right? In the midst of still challenging times in our world. But friends, the truth is God's expectations haven't changed. We change some expediencies in how it is we accomplish the work and purposes of God. And challenging times kind of require you to be able to be adaptable when it comes to the expediencies, the tools that you use to accomplish what God has set before us. But may I be very clear that March 13th, 2020 did not change the expectations of God. What God expected of us is no different, January 16th, 2022, than they were March 12th, 2020. He's not being partial. He's not. So we need to be careful. To love the Lord with all my heart and with all my soul, to serve Him, to honor Him, to listen to His voice, to respect Him as God over all other things. All of that. Expectation. Though He's prescribing that to Israel in the text that we're reading from, that basic concept hasn't changed. And friends, the truth is God spent a lot of time, and you go back, and particularly in the Old Testament, you'll see moments of it in the New as well. But in particular in the Old Testament, you will see a series of corrective measures. You'll see God place expectations. You'll see man's failures. You'll see God put corrective measures in place, hoping that they'll turn. Sometimes they'll turn, then challenges will come. And you'll see this process happen throughout the history of man. But the truth is, God spends a lot of time trying to correct His people, trying to help them understand their responsibilities in better ways. In 1 Samuel chapter 13, 1 Samuel chapter 13 and in verse 13, notice, he said, "And Samuel said to Saul, you have done foolishly. You have not kept the commandment of the Lord your God, which He commanded you, for now the Lord would have established your kingdom over Israel forever." And the prophet goes to Saul and says, listen, God had great plans for you. And all you had to do was listen to Him. All you had to do was fulfill what He was asking of you, and the kingdom would have been your heritage forever. But now your kingdom shall not continue. The Lord has sought for Himself a man after His own heart. And the Lord has commanded him to be commander over his people, because you have not kept what the Lord commanded you. Do what the Lord has asked, and He will bless. We've seen that in several of our texts so far this morning. But note that there are times where God's saying, listen, I need to use corrective measures. I need to put in place some things that might guide or nudge or lead or push, whatever it needs, to get me back on right track. And let's be honest, spiritually all of us find ourselves in need of varying types of corrective measures sometimes. Sometimes I just need to say, hey, Brian, the path is not there, the path is here. Guidance. Sometimes I need somebody to take me by the shoulders and turn me and say, the path is there. Sometimes I need somebody to take me by the hand and say, let's go down the path. And sometimes I need somebody to drag me there. Reprove, rebuke, exhort with all long-suffering and doctrine. That's the way the New Testament writers speak of it. But my point, friends, is this. All of us will be in need of corrective measures sometimes. How we respond to that will affect our spiritual well-being. How we react to somebody saying, listen, maybe you ought to consider that that's not the best choice. That if you would do this instead, maybe that would put you in a better path. Or somebody saying, listen, let me help you here. Let me walk, right? And rather than resisting and shelling up and clamming up and getting frustrated and defensive because somebody has tried to help me, maybe I need to open my heart and my mind to what somebody's actually trying to do for me. Have you ever stopped to think that maybe God is sending me a Samuel? Or maybe like David, He's sending me a Nathan. Or maybe like Peter, He's sending him a Paul. To say, hey, you could improve. This could get better. You could find a better path if you'll listen. Don't always, and I'm speaking to myself here, by the way, don't always push away and become defensive when somebody might be trying to give some guidance or aid or help or something to consider. Because you just don't know sometimes who God may be using to try to help me get on a corrected path. Because historically, that's exactly what He's done. He's created expectations, requirements, if you will, of all of us. And then along the path, for various individuals and circumstances, He'll then help correct when that path is not being honored. Historical expectations. But within that, may I suggest to you that those expectations are also at times very personal. In the book of Ezekiel, Ezekiel chapter 18, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel. We go to Ezekiel about once a year, so I know it's hard to find. I had a fellow Bill tell me one time that I wasn't a very good preacher because I had a tabbed Bible. Can you believe that? I was like 20 years old. Anyway, never mind. And it was a gift. I was using a gift. Oh, don't get me. How did I get started on that, Bill? How did you didn't even say anything. You just looked at me and it reminded me of it. Anyway. Sometimes we have trouble finding. It's Ezekiel chapter 18. I think I've given you enough time to get there now. Ezekiel chapter 18, verse 20. Notice, he said, the soul who sins shall die. The son shall not bear the guilt of the father, nor the father bear the guilt of the son. The righteousness of the righteous shall be upon himself, and the wickedness of the wicked shall be upon himself. And my point from this text is simply this. At the end of the day, God's expectations for Brian are Brian's responsibility to handle. God may send me a Samuel, God may send me a Nathan once in a while, God may send me a Paul once in a while, God may send people into my life to try to help, nudge, push, direct, guide, what I might need in a certain circumstance. But at the end of the day, I'm responsible. At the end of the day, I'm going to have to stand before God and answer, did I do wickedly or did I do righteously? The soul that sins is responsible for the sin. At the end of the day, there may be all kinds of circumstances and situations. There may be all kinds of things that we say, well, that influenced me, or that led me there, or that pushed me there, or the devil made me do it. But at the end of the day, the Bible is pretty clear about personal responsibility. God has a rightful expectation of me personally. Not just collectively, not just mankind in general, not just human beings in general. He has a rightful expectation of me. And I'm going to talk about that again before we're done today in the very last point. But we've got to personalize these expectations. And again, we need to be cautious that we're not making all these comparisons where we say, well, that guy or this lady or this, and just honor the fact that God has historically had expectations upon His people, and it has been our responsibility to honor and fulfill those things every step of the way. Go back into the book of Deuteronomy again for a moment. Deuteronomy chapter 30. And I didn't know how else in a chart to label this, so I just called it further expectations. But just read with me for a little bit here. Deuteronomy chapter 30, beginning in verse 15. See, I have set before you today life and good, death and evil. Pause. Choice. The interesting thing about it is historically God says, here are my expectations, but don't expect me to remove all the bad choices out of the way for you. Don't expect me to make you do something just so that it'll come out in a good way. God has expectations, but those expectations are built around my responsibility, my opportunity, and my rightful expectation to make wise choices. Good and bad are set before us daily, right? Good things and bad things on a daily basis are set before us, and we've got decisions and choices to make in light of it. And that I command you, verse 16 today, to love the Lord your God. When you're making those choices, then we've already talked about this, love the Lord your God, to walk in His ways, to keep His commandments, His statutes, His judgments, that you may live and multiply, and the Lord your God will bless you in the land which you go to possess. Now, I realize this has some very specific meanings to those in Israel. I'm not trying to cheapen that. But there's some application that you and I can appreciate from it. And God says, when you're making your choices, be wise in that, because they're going to have consequences or reward depending on which way you go. You know, it's interesting, I've always thought it fascinating, that word judgment's always been curious to me. Because, statutes I get, right? That's a law. Or a command. That's an instruction. Do this. Or here's the law. Here's the statute. But judgments imply that I'm making decisions and choices based on a standard. God has a moral standard. God has a legal standard under that Old Testament law. God has various standards by which that are just who He is. And He wants me to make judgments and choices and decisions based on the values that He possesses and that He hopes that all of us will possess as well. And sometimes I think when we're thinking about these expectations that God has upon us and we're trying to make decisions and choices, we're not as honest with ourselves sometimes as we should be. Sometimes God has very clearly told us what's the right decision. We're just resisting it. And the expectations we've placed upon ourselves are not exactly measuring up to the judgments that God would have us to render. Notice verse 17. If your heart turns away, so that you do not hear and are drawn away and worship other gods and serve them, I announce to you today that you shall surely perish. How clearer could God make it? The end result of departing from God is clearly stated. Go back in the history of the people and you'll find it's exactly what happened. They suffered consequence when they severed their relationship with God over and over again. God says to me, I have a right to expect these things from you, and if you decide to do something different, I announce to you today there's consequence to that. You shall not prolong your days in the land which you cross over the Jordan to go in and possess. And I call heaven and earth as witnesses today against you, that I have set before you life and death, blessing and cursing. Therefore choose life, that both you and your descendants may live. Maybe that's a topic for another time, because this morning, but time-wise, but it's interesting, isn't it? Every individual is responsible for their own decisions and choices. Every individual, God says, here's my expectation. The man who sins faces the consequences. The man who chooses wickedness, results of that, righteousness. We understand that out of Ezekiel. But God also says in this narrative, particularly to Israel, I think it applies today, be careful what you choose, because it will not just impact my own personal paths, but it will impact the paths of others. And I don't think that God's saying that somehow the next generation will have no culpability or no responsibility because what their parents did. What he's saying is, if the generation prior isn't careful how they measure up to the expectations of God, then the result of that may be a series of historical challenges for the people. Which, by the way, go back in their history, it's exactly what happened. But God says, listen, I'm calling this world that I created as witness. You have options. I set life and death, good and bad, blessing and cursing. There are options. May I etch that into all of our minds this morning. When I'm considering the expectations and requirements of God, when I'm considering what it is God is asking of Brian, then may I always remember that God has always given options. He didn't say, here's death and that's all you got. Here's cursings and that's all you got. Here's evil and that's all you got. God has historically always set life, death, good, bad, evil, righteousness. The options have always been there. There have been multitude of times in my life where I've blinded myself to that which is good. There have been lots of times where I chose evil when the good was right in front of me. There have been lots of times in my life where I've transgressed and fallen short of the will of God. But not because I didn't have options, but because I chose the wrong ones. And admitting that, friends, is a helpful thing. Being honest about that is helpful. Because then the next time those options come before me, I won't say, well, there's only one and it's bad. We've probably all said something like that in some circumstance, haven't we? Here's the situation, here are options, and none of them are good. Right? Well, there may be some pretty difficult circumstances, and maybe none of the options look very helpful or very pleasant. But when it comes to life, when it comes to what God expects of us, there's always a good option available. And He has a rightful expectation of us to pursue those. Love the Lord your God, verse 20, that you may obey His voice. Cause and effect, by the way, I believe. When you love the God with all your heart and all the soul and all your mind, you won't have a problem listening to His voice. I won't have a problem obeying His instructions. I won't have a problem choosing the options. When there's a love issue, there'll be an obedience issue. I think that's a fair conclusion. And that you may cling to Him, for He is your life and the length of your days, and that you may dwell in the land which the Lord swore to your fathers, to Abraham, Isaac, and to Jacob, to give to them. Cling. It's a good word. Cling to Him. Deborah and I, the other day, were talking. I already headed down this path, and I'm second guessing. I'm trying to put it now in a way that I won't give names and to protect the innocent. But I remember when our children were younger, when we still lived in Moundsville, and we would walk them to school, and there was another fellow that would walk his grandson to school, and we'd kind of meet up. We knew each other, and we'd meet up on that path walking over to the school. Well, as Sam, who was a little younger than that fellow's grandson, got to a certain point, he kind of wanted to be able to have a little independence, and so we'd walk him to the corner, and he'd walk from that point on up, and we'd watch him walk. Well, this grandson had a grandson who'd clinged to him all the way to the door for years. And now, because what Sam was doing, the grandson didn't want to cling anymore. He wanted his liberty to be able to walk up to the school as well from the corner. My point is this. You think about that grandchild, or you think about and how that they make that connection, and there's a security they feel. And they hold on and they cling, and there's a trust. That's the imagery here. I cling to God because I trust Him. I cling to God because when I don't really know what's best, I know He does. I cling to God because He'll never put me on the wrong path. I cling to God because He'll always put me in the right places. I cling to God because He'll always present to me the best options. But I guarantee you, the weakest I've ever been in my faith have always been connected to my failure to hold on to Him. The further I've distanced myself from God, the weaker I've become every time. Every time. God has a right to expect all kinds of things from me, but He gives me great tools in order to get there. Love Him so much that you want to cling and hold on. And avoid all those empty tokens. Avoid all those things that are just kind of my way of saying, well, here, God, have this today. You know, I've used this illustration for years, and then I kind of quit, but I'll go back to it for a minute. Now, there'll inevitably somebody here this morning, they'll come to me and say, well, Brian, you know you can make potato pancakes out of old mashed potatoes. I don't care. They're still not any good. All right? Leftover mashed potatoes are useless, in my humble opinion. I don't care for leftover mashed potatoes. Did you figure that out, by the way, by what I was saying? Leftovers, we can kind of take them or leave them, right? Leftovers are kind of like, well, if I don't have anything else. My reason for bringing that up is sometimes that's all we offer God. God, I exhausted everything else I had on this over here, but here, take this. You can have this. And God says, I don't want that. I don't want the second, third, fourth, and fifth fruits. I don't want what's left over. I don't want you digging around your refrigerator of life going, can I find something for God today? God has greater expectations of me than that. Isaiah chapter 1, verse 10. Let me read just a few verses quickly. Hear the word of the Lord, you rulers of Sodom. Give ear to the law of our God, you people of Gomorrah. To what purpose is the multitude of your sacrifices to me, says the Lord? I've had enough of burnt offerings of rams and the fat of fed cattle. I do not delight in the blood of bulls or of lambs or goats. When you come to appear before me, who has required this from your hand? To trample my courts. Bring no more futile sacrifices. Incense is an abomination to me. The new moons, the Sabbaths, the calling of assemblies. I cannot endure iniquity and the sacred meeting. The history of the people was every time they got in trouble with God, they tried to create a new holy day, new sacrifice. Let's go burn some incense to God and He'll feel better about everything. Finally, God, through the prophet Isaiah, says, I'm tired of it. He's reached a breaking point. His expectations are greater than that. He doesn't want all of these things. He wants them. I'm weary of bearing them, he says at the end of verse 14. The consequence is, in verse 15, I will hide my eyes from you. Even though you make many prayers, I'll not hear. Your hands are all full of blood. Wash yourselves. Make yourselves clean. Put away the evil of your doings from before my eyes. Cease to do evil and learn to do good. Seek justice, rebuke the oppressor, defend the fatherless, plead for the widow. Come now, let us reason together. We looked at that a few weeks ago. Let's reason together. If you're willing and obedient, you shall eat the good of the land. But if you refuse and rebel, you shall be devoured by the sword, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken. We've said this on numerous occasions, but it's worthy of this in this lesson as well, to remind ourselves that God expects the best of us and has a rightful expectation of that. God doesn't want what's left over. God doesn't want what I've decided God wants. Does that make sense? That's what they had done. They thought what God wanted was another sacrifice, another ram, another bull, another incense, another. That's what they thought. I'm going to say this, and then let me give it all to you, though. Because I want to give you a modern-day comparison. God doesn't want more assemblies. He wants more of you. The assemblies will follow. The desire to come together will follow. When the people give their hearts to God, they'll want to come worship. They'll want to involve themselves in those things. They'll want to do that more. The idea of having more assemblies is just as a hope that that'll make us more pious or that'll help us be greater connected to God, is to fall prey to the very thing that was happening in Isaiah 1. God didn't tell them, don't do the sacrifices at all anymore that I commanded you. He said, quit relying upon the idea that if I do more of them, you'll be happier with me. That He would never be happier with them until they changed who they were and how they behaved and what they did. That was His expectation. And He expects the same of me. We just get the cart before the horse sometimes, and because of that, we think about things in kind of mixed up ways. Because God has expectations of me. Let's just go to the Matthew text. Matthew chapter 5. Matthew chapter 5, verse 20. Jesus speaking on this occasion. For I say to you that unless your righteousness exceeds the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, you will by no means enter the kingdom of heaven. You know, it's an interesting way that Jesus did that in that text. What I believe Jesus is trying to get them to understand is simply this. Do not create a system of expectations based on the wrong standard. If the scribes and Pharisees are your standard by which you're measuring your spirituality, He says you're going to fail. You're not going to get where I need you to be. Because unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, they are not the standard. And so this morning, friends, as I conclude this study with you, I simply want to encourage all of us to realize that the expectations we've been speaking of all morning are that of God, and He's the only one who, number one, has the right to set those expectations, and He's the only one we ought to be paying attention to. If I establish expectations of myself spiritually based on other people or other standards or other measures, I'm not going to get where I need to be. We all do that sometimes. And I think, and I get it, I understand why. We get tired, we get weary. And I'm looking to feel better. Right? I'm looking to feel better. And so what do? Well, I say, I'm doing better than that. Or at least I'm not. And that's the wrong view. Let's just do everything we can to give our heart, our soul, and our love and service and cling to the Father and fulfill the expectations that He rightfully has of all of us. And let that be enough. Because it is enough to just simply do all that God has asked of each of us. This morning you may be subject to the gospel in some way. We're going to sing this song together. What will your answer be? How will you respond to what God is asking of each of us? How will you and I react and respond to the promises God is saying? I'll bless you, I'll aid you, I'll give you life if you'll honor and live up to my expectations. If we can encourage you in that this morning, if we could aid you in making that choice and decision, if we could help you in some way, what will your answer be even this hour? Won't you come as we stand and as we sing?